All right, I think we'll begin. My name is Greg Marfleet. I'm a political science professor. I want to thank you all for being here for Morgan Wallen's talk. This project actually started well before I got involved with Barbara Allen, who couldn't be here because she's on leave, and so I'm standing here. But Morgan came to solicit my advice on her content analysis project, which was extensive, complicated, I think nuanced. And so she made many trips to my office seeking assistance as she went along. She had this habit of wearing wooden shoes, and I could hear her coming up the stairs of the Willis Hall. And I may have to seek therapy, aversion therapy stuff. I don't know. No, I tease her because it turned out so well, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. Morgan's paper recently won Best Paper at the Midwest Political Science Undergraduate Research Conference, which is So we share that with you, and I think you'll enjoy the paper. I think it's ambitious, provocative, controversial, maybe a little topical, pugnacious, maybe all the things that we might associate with the unique intellect of Morgan Wallen. So I won't stand here any longer, and I'll give him the floor to Morgan.
Okay, thank you all for being here today. There's absolutely no point to do research if people don't want to hear about it. So it makes a huge difference that you're all here. And as Greg said, my name is Morgan Weiland, and the topic of the talk today, and also the title of the paper, is Tacit Consent, the American News Media and Minority Tyranny. The manner in which minority groups are able to have power in democratic societies is an incredibly important question, because it points to one of the fundamental paradoxes of democracy, and American democracy in particular, such that minority groups have so much power when we would imagine that the majority would be the group that would have power in a democracy. By examining models of minority tyranny and public opinion formation, I argue that neoconservatives, a salient minority in today's society, have been able to shape public discourse through the tacit consent of the American news media. There we go. All right. First, we're going to talk about Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, French political philosopher. Through studying the American point of departure, and by point of departure, that basically means initial conditions, as well as the American Revolution, Tocqueville became very concerned about public opinion and minority tyranny in democratic societies, which he thought to be one of the most important vulnerabilities in democracies. So to explain a little bit what Tocqueville's talking about here, essentially Tocqueville looks at the American point of departure, or like I said, the initial conditions in America, and says there are two fundamental parts to these initial conditions: Puritan covenant thinking and equality of conditions. And both of these points of departure that characterize America are based on the Puritan foundations of our society. So to begin with, the Puritan covenant thinking, as Tocqueville explains, is rooted in the Puritans' belief that they enter into a contractual, consensual, and voluntary relationship with God. And this particular relationship that they have with God, they want to replicate that relationship in society through voluntary associations, through entering into voluntary associations with other people, other human beings, not God, obviously. So the point of this is that Puritans have a certain idea of a moral, civic duty that they feel that they have to replicate their relationship with God within society. And this particular line of thinking, this covenant thinking, what this leads to is a lot of associations within society. And these associations yield the development of public reasoning as opposed to public opinion. And public reasoning, developing this faculty of public reasoning, yields important mores that characterize American society, such as political virtue, self-reliance, civic engagement. And all of this, Tocqueville explains, is incredibly important because it wards off against the tyranny of the majority. However, on the other hand, there is no guarantee, as Tocqueville explains, against the tyranny of the majority. And the second point of departure, this equality of conditions, leads to, as Tocqueville explains, the potential for the tyranny of the majority. And Tocqueville explains this here, the equality of conditions, the second point of departure that I mentioned earlier, leads to the dogma of the Republic. And what exactly is that? The dogma of the Republic is essentially the idea that the people or the majority are always right. And so when you have this dogma of the Republic, this leads to the tyranny of majority in society. So how does this happen? Essentially, the way in which this occurs is that you live in a society and everybody's equal. So you think, oh, this guy's equal and this girl's equal, so we're all equal and I don't really have respect for anybody. But at the same time, you feel really alienated and you feel isolated because there's this huge, nameless, faceless mass of people, much like you in the audience, and I'm the individual. I feel so alienated, there's so many of you, I feel so alone, and therefore I go, okay, I've got to turn, I'm afraid of the majority, so I have to turn to a caretaker government, centralized power to protect me against all of you, because you're so scared. And so this, Tocqueville explains, is democratic despotism. Democratic despotism is essentially mild bureaucratic tyranny. We can think about it a la Kafka or Orwell's 1984, that kind of mild bureaucratic tyranny. And so this, Tocqueville explains, is dangerous. And the second consequence here, the second point of departure, this equality of conditions, and this consequence that we've just discussed here, points to the importance of public opinion formation in the development of democratic despotism. So it's useful to look at Tocqueville's model of minority tyranny and how public opinion formation occurs. So this is Tocqueville's model of public opinion formation. Tocqueville explains essentially that you have, his explanation of the model of how public opinion is formed is based on his discussion that we just talked about the dogma of the republic, about the power of these majority groups in society. And so Tocqueville explains that essentially individuals have an opinion and they look to society and they want to see their personal opinion replicated in society because the majority rule is so powerful that you want to see your opinion coincide with what the majority has to say. You want to fit in. So the individual looks to society, and if they don't see their personal belief replicated by the majority, they silence themselves and therefore they're self-censored. On the other hand, if the individual looks to society and sees their belief replicated in what they believe to be the majority, therefore they feel confident, continue to express their opinion, this reinforces their ideas, and they feel confident. Now the interesting insight that Tocqueville is offering to us here is located right here, this nexus. Essentially what's going on is that the perceived majority belief on the part of the individual when they look to society is actually the belief of the minority. And, this might seem paradoxical, but it is paradoxical, but it makes a lot of sense, and we can understand Tocqueville's line of reasoning when we think of the collective action paradox. And when we think of the collection action paradox, basically, a collective action paradox, the idea is that minority groups are very well organized. They're small, they have a clear agenda, they can mobilize, it's easy for them. Majority groups are big and dispersed and disorganized, and they're kind of a mess. So these minority groups, these small groups, are able to promote their ideas through the moral power of the democratic majority, which is this dogma of the republic that we were talking about earlier. And therefore, this perceived majority belief is actually the belief and the power of these minority groups. And this is incredibly interesting. Tocqueville points this out, I think. This is, to me, very interesting because it helps us to better understand the relationship between democratic despotism and the tyranny of majority, which we now understand is really minority opinion. This is the most salient concept for our talk, particularly because Tocqueville is implying that the more despotic the state becomes, the more it can exploit this relationship right here, and therefore the more the state can potentially manipulate our opinion. In this particular scenario, the state would be the minority group here. Now, Tocqueville doesn't exactly play this idea out to its logical conclusion, but this is implied within his thinking, and will be very important for our talk. Now, building on Tocqueville's ideas, we're going to look at the work of Elizabeth Noelle Neumann, who updated Tocqueville's ideas of public opinion formation for the 20th century by incorporating the important role of mass media. Essentially, Noelle Neumann argues that the mass media is incredibly important because it constructs how we perceive reality. We look to the mass media, and that's how we come to understand what our reality is. Essentially, we can divide Noelle Neumann's work up into two different models, which, like I said, this is basically the same thing as Tocqueville's work, it just incorporates the importance of the mass media. In the silencing model here, the individual has a belief, they look to society. If they don't see their opinion expressed in the mass media, like in Tocqueville's model, they silence themselves because of their fear of isolation, disrespect, unpopularity, etc. Now, on the other hand, there's the feedback model, where the individual has a belief, they look to society, see that belief expressed in the mass media, feel confident, and therefore continue to express their belief, which creates this kind of feedback model where you amplify this one particular view, and therefore that view becomes the majority view, even though it may be, in fact, the minority view. Now, because of the important role that the mass media plays, as defined by Elizabeth Noelle Neumann, it's important to look at the political science literature pertaining to mass media and public opinion formation. Now, the first author we're going to look at is Timothy Cook, who writes on the institutional nature of the media and how the institutional nature of the news media creates embedded biases within its functioning, which allows for minority groups to have an uncanny amount of power. Essentially, there are three characteristics of the media as an institution that we will examine, and this is the first one here, the second one here, and the third one here. Okay, so we'll take this step by step. The first way that the media is an institution, as Cook explains, is that it has unspoken procedures, routines, and assumptions. And these routines, procedures, and assumptions have implicit choices within them, such that journalists look to other news sources, they go where the news allegedly happens, and they rely on sources, and I quote him, in a position to know. That's the first institutional characterization of the news media. The second institutional characterization is that it has endurance over time and extension across organizations. Essentially, three elements push news outlets closer together such that there is extension across organizations, that there's this commonality, this institutional commonality among different news organizations. And these 3 points are political environment, professionalism, and uncertainty. So beginning with the political environment, this is essentially an institutional feature that is much like the first point that we talked about, such that journalists go to official sources, these people who allegedly are in a position to know. Second, you have the institutional constraint of professionalism, such that journalists have these professional constraints where they have to be objective and impartial in the way that they report. And finally, there is the institutional constraint of uncertainty, such that journalists don't always know where is the news, how do you make it, where is it coming from, what am I supposed to report on, which leads to two other institutional features called pool and pack journalism. Pack journalism is essentially the desire to stay in line with other journalists so that you are right, that you're reporting on the correct news, whatever that might mean. And the second is pool journalism, which is that journalists come to rely on one another for stories so as to decrease their uncertainty. So we have these three institutional characterizations of the... Oh, actually, why don't I tell you what the third one is before I tell you what the point of this is? All right, the third characterization is the government and journalist relationship. Essentially, the government relies on the news media to disseminate news, not only because this is practical, but because of the philosophical underpinnings of the relationship between the news media and the government. I mean, we can think of the freedom of the press. There is this sort of implicit relationship between the news media and the government. Okay, so those are the three institutional features. And now I can tell you why this is important. Essentially, Cook argues that these three institutional characterizations of the news media leads to the media's reliance on and privileging of government opinion. And this is incredibly important. And this idea is basically what Cook describes as co-production. And to illuminate a little further exactly what co-production is, we're going to look at this model here on the bottom. Co-production is essentially a situation in which journalists have certain institutional constraints on them. I only have a certain amount of time to get the story out. I can only put a certain amount of effort into writing this story, and I have to have these important and interesting sources so that I can validate my work. And these institutional constraints on the journalists lead them to choose authoritative sources as opposed to potentially equally available and interesting alternative sources. So this model ultimately leads to the stories having a government bias embedded within them. Now, even though Cook points to the importance of the government and therefore the potential of minority tyranny in public opinion formation and the role of the news media, most political science literature doesn't talk about this. Most political science literature instead focuses on the relationship right here between the news media and public opinion formation. And three different concepts are most salient when you're looking at the political science literature: framing, agenda setting, and priming. So we'll take each one of these in turn. First, framing. Framing is essentially how media content is packaged so as to allow for certain interpretations and to rule out other interpretations. To give you an example of how framing works, Iyengar, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, did a study, Greg is nodding, okay, did a study about frames of poverty in the news media. And essentially when there are episodic frames of poverty used, his respondents said, oh, poverty is the fault of poor people, obviously. But when there were thematic frames used, the respondents said, oh, it's societal ills, it's society's fault that people are poor. So frames are very powerful in shaping how people perceive and process information. Second is the idea of agenda setting. Agenda setting is essentially the function of the news media that determines what subjects people think about, and not necessarily how they think, but what they choose to think about. It's very much so the title of agenda setting, what's in the agenda. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And this is the definition used by Iyengar and Kinder, McCombs and Shaw, and Alger. So it's a pretty well-accepted definition of agenda setting. Unfortunately, the definition of priming is kind of conflated in the political science literature with agenda setting. So I don't think there's a lot of clarity between these two different definitions. But if we're going to give a definition to priming, although it's similar to agenda setting, it would be as follows. Priming is the process by which certain portions of media content are foregrounded and others are sidelined. But the point of all of these is that this is what the literature focuses on, and I think this is limiting. I really think that this model just doesn't adequately encompass the way in which public opinion is formed, nor does it discuss the relationship between the government and the news media. And so therefore, what I have done in my work is to hypothesize and reconceptualize the literature and offer a new model that takes into account this primary causal relationship between the government and the news media. And I think this is important because it takes into account Tocqueville and Noel and Neumann's work about minority tyranny, as well as Cook's insights about the institutional nature of the news media. So this points us to look at the government. And essentially, this is important because I am saying the government frames, agenda sets, and primes issues for the news media. I have empirically tested this work by looking at the degree to which the neoconservative minority in our society has been able to frame, agenda set, and prime issues vis-a-vis the news media, and in particular the New York Times. Now, before I go on to explain my methodology, it's important to define exactly what I mean by neoconservative, because this particular ideology is disputed, and it's very difficult to say that there is one definition of neoconservatism. So to give you a little background about how I'm conceptualizing this, it's important to say that neoconservatism is often seen as rooted in the thinking of Leo Strauss, a political philosopher who taught at the University of Chicago from 1949 to 1968. However, Leo Strauss never said, I'm a neoconservative. He never aligned himself with these ideas, so it's impossible to pin neoconservatism on him. However, people like Irving Kristol and Norman Pothurst, et cetera, have self-identified as neoconservatives and said, I'm going to interpret Strauss, and I'm going to say that I'm a neoconservative, and I think X, Y, and Z. So I look to how they identify themselves and how they define themselves as neoconservatives as a fair interpretation of what neoconservatism is. Additionally, I look to the policies and the thinking of people within the Bush administration who are labeled as and often self-identify as neoconservatives, people such as Wolfowitz and Pearl and others. And I look at what they have to say about neoconservatism and say that I can use what they have to, how they identify themselves, to define my thinking about neoconservatism. So I'm not trying to say that I have a comprehensive understanding of it or that there is one definition of it, but that there is indeed, it is possible to look at people's subjective descriptions of themselves and of their own ideology in order to come to some understanding about what neoconservatism is. With that qualification put into place, let's discuss exactly what I mean by neoconservatism. I've divided my thinking into two parts. First, domestic, and second, foreign policy. Under the domestic category, first is the idea of nationalism. Irving Kristol explains that there is a pervasive nihilism, which he says is linked to Strauss's work. We can dispute that, whatever that may be. That there's a pervasive nihilism within American society. In order to counteract this nihilism in which people are alienated and isolated and kind of locked into their individual selves, it's important to have national myths to pull people outside of themselves and bring them together and offer social cohesion. So the first idea here is nationalism. Second idea is American exceptionalism, which is tethered to the idea of nationalism. American exceptionalism essentially puts forth the idea that there is an American national destiny that we have yet to realize, but that is waiting out there. We're kind of like Rome. You can think of it that way. There is this destiny that we need to fulfill one day. Okay, so this is tied to the idea of nationalism, but is a distinct part of it, so we can divide these into two different ideas. The third idea is religion. And religion, in much of the same vein as nationalism, emphasizes the importance of myths, emphasizes the importance of myth perpetuation in society, so as to bring people out of their nihilistic selves and to bring them into some sort of social cohesion. Now, when I say religion, I don't mean Christianity. This is any religion. The neoconservatives don't specify. It doesn't really seem to matter. And actually, many neoconservative thinkers are in fact Jewish. So this is not about religious fundamentalism or evangelical Christianity. So if that's what you're thinking, that's not what I'm talking about. And the final of these four different domestic side of neoconservative thinking that I have worked out is implicit within the other three, and that is community values. Clearly, if neoconservatives think that we live in a nihilistic society, what would be implicit is that they value community values. Don't look at the individual, look at the group, emphasize values that have to do with the community. Now for foreign policy implications of this thinking. On the foreign policy side, we can first see the idea that America can and should and has, in fact, acted unilaterally. Because we are an exceptional nation and we have an exceptional destiny that we need to fulfill, we don't need permission to act the way we want to. We can act unilaterally, and that's just fine. Second, neoconservatives conceive of the world in terms of good and evil, in terms of black and white. And this particular worldview I have termed as global moral polarity. Third, preemptive war is kind of a consequence of unilateralism plus global moral polarity equals preemptive war. And what I mean by that is that if we are, in fact, exceptional and therefore can act on our own, and if there's good and evil in the world, clearly with America coming down on the side of good, we might have to act preemptively at times because there's evil out there, as evil as neoconservatives would put it. There's evil in the world, and therefore America often should and can morally act against those adversaries. Now, fourth here, we have the idea of the extreme characterization of adversaries. And this particular concept is essentially the underbelly of everything that I've been talking about. If neoconservatives rally America's identity around a positive view of themselves, around a positive view of the nation of America, the other side of this particular identity is rallying around a negative view of your adversaries. So we have this fourth category under foreign policy, extreme characterization of adversaries. And finally, there's the category of under attack. And under attack is a consequence of the idea that there is a national myth about America, and we have this identity that we're trying to realize, but we haven't yet realized. And the fact that there's a presence of enemies in the world. And the fact that these two coexist mean that America is threatened, and that America is potentially going to be sidetracked by these adversaries and unable to reach its national destiny. So there's this pervasive feeling of threat and of being under attack. Now that we've explained what neoconservatism at least means in the context of this paper, I can go on and explain my methodology. First, I coded presidential speeches given by George H.W., this current president, George Bush, about the war in Iraq, terrorism, foreign policy, essentially seeking the administration's foreign policy perspective. I coded speeches between the dates of 11 September 2001 and 12 September 2002, as these dates bracket the period in which he was developing his thinking about terrorism, about preemptive war, basically when the Bush Doctrine was being put forward. This yielded a set of 25 speeches. To narrow these speeches down and establish prominence among them, I used LexisNexis, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, particularly our reference librarians here, to choose those speeches that had the longest duration of coverage in the 2 weeks period after the speech was given. And I did this by, if you use LexisNexis, you see newspaper hits. When you type something in, newspaper articles is basically what you're looking at. And so I chose those speeches that had the longest duration of coverage in a 2-week period after the speech was given in these newspaper articles, as well as those speeches that most frequently appeared on the front page. And so I used these two factors to determine prominence. This yielded a set of 8 speeches. I then coded these 8 speeches using latent content analysis, with words or phrases as the unit of analysis. And I coded them by neoconservative category. And the neoconservative categories that I'm talking about are those that I just mentioned in the previous slide. Each one of those ideas that I enumerated were developed into categories by which I coded it. Now, this is all well and good, but you probably are thinking, how did she go about doing this? It sounds like a lot of jargon. So why don't we give you an example of the way in which I coded a speech. Your friend and mine, President Bush, will talk for a little while with us. This is a speech that he gave on the eve of September 11th, 2001. Play a couple of clips for you, and then I'll explain to you exactly how I coded this. Let's make sure our volume. All right.
A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Okay, so how did I code this? First, the phrases great nation, great people, and brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world were coded as American exceptionalism, because these particular phrases indicate that there is some sort of superlative, it's the use of superlative. Think of it, it's very literature, English-based when you're coding something. You're thinking about rhetoric and word choice. And Bush is choosing these very positive superlatives to describe our nation. So that's how I coded those particular word choices. I think equally as obvious is the coding of the word choice of evil and evil acts. This very clearly demonstrates that the administration conceives the world in terms of good and evil, black and white, so I coded this as global moral polarity. One of the neoconservative categories that I discussed earlier. I coded his phrase, caring for strangers and neighbors, as community values. Again, it's clearly important to the administration to foreground the importance of the community over the individual, and therefore I coded that phrase as such. Finally, the infamous line, "will make no distinction between terrorists and those who harbor them," I don't remember exactly how that goes, but we all know that line, was coded as preemptive war, because this particular line demonstrates that the administration feels comfortable with and believes that they have the right and the moral authority to act preemptively against other countries. So that's how I coded this. This gives you a sense of how I coded these different speeches. Now moving on to the New York Times articles that I coded. You might be asking yourself, why the New York Times? So before I explain to you how I coded, I want to tell you why I chose the New York Times. Essentially, the New York Times is the nation's paper of record. Additionally, it's not crazy left-wing or crazy right-wing. It's pretty much down the middle. And if anything, it's a little bit liberal, which just makes my job a little bit more difficult trying to find the influence of a conservative administration in a supposedly left-wing paper. Okay, so how did I code this? I was seeking neoconservative influence in New York Times articles, and I chose articles during 2-week periods after September 11th, 2001, when the terrorist attacks happened, September 12th, 2002, when Bush gave his speech to the UN in New York about justifying preemptive war in Iraq, and finally, March 20th, 2003, when we actually invaded Iraq. I searched within ProQuest using very specific search terms, not only pertaining to foreign policy, the war in Iraq, and terrorism, but also search terms that located and emphasized the events happening on these different days. This yielded a set 483 articles, which were then imported into the program. EndNote. Now, 483 articles is a lot, so I didn't want to code all of those, so I narrowed this down a little bit, because that's a little overwhelming. So to establish relevance, I oversampled articles on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays, as those days had the heaviest representation of news articles. I then used a random numbers table to choose 97 articles, or 20% of my overall sample size. So then I went about coding these 97 articles in a very similar way in which I coded the President Bush's speeches using latent content analysis. I coded not only for neoconservative category expression, which was coded by paragraph, and paragraph as delineated by the New York Times. I also coded for tone and level of critique, which was coded by article. And by tone, I mean the stance that the article took vis-a-vis these neoconservative categories, be it positive, neutral, or negative, as well as level of critique, which could either be critical, offering multiple perspectives and enabling the reader to make a decision for themselves, or conduit, only offering one perspective and therefore making the decision for the reader. Again, I want to explain to you and demonstrate how I coded New York Times articles, so I'm going to read this brief excerpt published in 2002 by Shulman and then tell you exactly how I coded this. In the war on terrorism, President Bush leads a nation supportive of his general aims. Few doubt the malevolence of Saddam Hussein or the dangers posed by weapons of mass destruction. By engaging in public debate, by educating the American people and receiving the approval of their representatives, the president would only strengthen his hand. Cloaking himself in resolutions from his father's presidency, Mr. Bush could have ordered an invasion, but to do so without the considered judgment of his nation would only have fostered division at home and discomfort abroad. On the other hand, the mightiness of a great democracy, moved by deliberation to unified action, can comfort its allies and caution its enemies. First, how I coded for neoconservative category expression. I first coded this phrase here, war on terrorism, as extreme characterization of the adversary, as the journalist is clearly and voluntarily adopting the language of the administration, as well as agreeing with the administration that terrorism is indeed our adversary, and that a war on terrorism is in fact something that is feasible and something that is even possible, much like the war on drugs. Second, I have coded the line here, few doubt the benevolence of Saddam Hussein or the dangers posed by weapons of mass destruction. I coded this as under attack, as the journalist is unquestioningly agreeing with the White House that Iraq, first of all, has weapons of mass destruction and that they want to use them against the United States. Third here, I coded the phrase, the mightiness of a great democracy, as, you guessed it, American exceptionalism. Just the way Bush used a superlative to describe our nation, the journalist, too, is adopting this superlative rhetoric to describe America. Now, the tone of this article was coded as positive, as it takes a positive stance vis-a-vis these neoconservative categories. It adopts the language of neoconservatism, as well as adopts and confirms the ideas of neoconservatism. However, the level of critique of this article is critical because it offers a couple of different perspectives. It offers a couple of suggestions to Bush, you could have done that or you should have done this. It doesn't offer only one point of view, so this article is coded as critical. Now, that is everything for the methodology, and ultimately now I will talk about my findings, and my findings essentially show that my hypothesis is correct, that there is indeed a minority, the neoconservative minority, in the Bush administration, and that they have been able to shape public debate, that they have been able to frame, agenda set, and prime issues vis-a-vis the New York Times and the American news media. Now, this is our first slide for findings, and before I tell you exactly what this means, I want to explain to you how all this is color-coded. First here, the orange here are speeches, and the red are the New York Times articles. And each set of bars here is the percentage representation of different neoconservative categories across these two different media. And all the neoconservative categories are named here along the bottom. And this particular slide shows us that there's a similar emphasis across the two media of different neoconservative categories, such that the New York Times and the administration speeches represent this idea of extreme characterization of the adversary, for example, in almost identical, relatively identical emphasis. Now, this could show us, we could assume that perhaps this means that the New York Times is cue-taking from the administration, that they're listening to what the administration has to say and then just, unquestioningly cue-taking. However, it's possible to argue that in fact these similarities are just due to the New York Times responsiveness to the world around them and to current events, because this particular graph and these statistics don't place any value judgments and don't indicate what position the New York Times is taking vis-a-vis these categories. For all we know, they could just be criticizing the administration. Therefore, it's important for me to establish that there is in fact bias. And I will do that in the next set of slides. Now, before I explain these findings, I want to tell you how all this is color-coded. As you can see in the pie graph here on the left, we have every derivation, every possible combination of tone and level of critique. But this is a little more complicated to look at, and therefore I have simplified this visual representation here on the left. Actually you're right, but my left. Okay, so the way I've simplified this is by putting together all of the articles that I think support the administration's point of view. And those are all of the conduit articles and the positive critical articles. I put these articles together because the articles that are conduits are the ones that are only giving you one point of view. And I never found a negative conduit article. I only found neutral and positive conduit articles, and all of those articles that I coded supported the administration's perspective. Additionally, those articles that are positive and critical, although they might all offer multiple perspectives, they ultimately come down on the side of the administration, also support the administration's point of view. So these will be represented in blue. Now, on the other hand, these other articles are lumped together, the negative and neutral critical articles, because these are the articles that are actually doing what journalism is supposed to do. They're being fair and balanced. They're being honest. They are trying to actually hold up journalistic ethics and be objective. So so now you have a visual cue, a guide to how the rest of the next set of slides are going to be discussed. Okay, so what's going on in this particular slide? Here we can see that 42.2% of all of the articles that I coded support the administration's point of view. This is a huge number. This is absolutely ridiculous. Because you would imagine that a paper like the New York Times would have 100% objectivity because they say, we're objective, we're the nation's paper of record, you can read us, you can trust us, but you can't. Obviously, you cannot trust them because 42.2% of all the articles that I coded support the administration's point of view. More interestingly, of the front page articles that I coded, 66.7% of them supported the administration's perspective. This is an incredibly compelling finding because it shows that the New York Times not only privileged this slanted perspective absolutely, but also privileged it relatively. By absolutely, I mean that any article on the front page is being privileged. Those are the ones that are tacitly invested with importance, credibility, and as anyone knows who's ever picked up the New York Times, as I'm sure every one of us has, those are the articles you look at first and you think matter. In addition, the New York Times is privileging these articles relatively speaking, because in the sample set of articles that I coded, 42.2% of the articles support the neoconservative perspective. However, on the front page, the New York Times is upping the ante a bit and saying that actually this perspective is important relative to the expression that and the representation that we would give to this perspective throughout the entire paper, and we're going to actually put more articles relative to the rest of the paper on the front page. As we can see, 66.7 is a lot bigger than the number 42.2, so the New York Times, relatively speaking, is emphasizing neoconservative rhetoric and the neoconservative agenda by putting these articles on the front page. In a similar vein, when we look at the articles by article type, we can see that, okay, we have news articles, editorials, features, and op-eds. These are different article types. We can see that the news articles are the most biased. You would imagine that op-eds or commentaries or features or editorials would be biased. But in fact, 47.8% of the time, the news articles were the ones that were biased. And the editorials, features, and commentaries, op-eds were only biased about 33% of the time each. Again, like front page articles, news articles are tacitly invested with validity, objectivity, and credibility, but they're the ones that, in my sample set, were the most biased. Now, you might be asking yourself, how can I assert that these conduit and positive critical articles are in fact biased? You might say, you need to prove that, because it's a pretty severe statement to make. So I have two different ways that I'm going to show that I'm actually right in asserting this. First, when I looked at all of the instances of neoconservative category expression by the type of article, their tone and the level of critique, by the type of article in which these neoconservative categories were expressed within, 73.3% of them were conduits and positive criticals, meaning that the positive, critical, and conduit articles are the ones that most frequently, 73.3% of the time, adopt and express neoconservative rhetoric. Additionally, when looking for alternative frames, and alternative frames are shown here. What do I mean by alternative frames? Most frames that I coded for were these neoconservative frames, but I also noted if the article put forth a different frame, like economy or history. Whenever an alternative frame was expressed, overwhelmingly, 93.7% of the time, it was in a negative or neutral critical article. Only like 6.6% of the time did it even appear in these positive critical or conduit articles, further demonstrating, in fact, that I am correct in asserting that conduits and positive critical articles do in fact have bias because they are the ones that not only take up these neoconservative categories most often, but they hardly ever offer any different frame to the issues that are at hand. Now the next three slides of findings are divided in a slightly different way, so I want to explain the way in which they're divided so we can all be on the same page with this. These three slides essentially are to demonstrate that bias changes over time, and that in fact, bias did change over time in the New York Times. First, we have the time period here. We have the article tone and level of critique here, color-coded the same way that we've been discussing in the past few slides. We have neoconservative category expression within articles, and each different neoconservative category is color-coded here, and here's the key. You're never going to read all that, so don't worry about it. I'll tell you the most important parts of that. And then in the final category here, we have neoconservative category expression in speeches, and these two are color-coded the same way. Okay, so we can see in this first time period of September 11th, 2001, that 50% of the articles support the administration's point of view, as seen here in blue. Interestingly, there's a concurrent, something going on here I think that is mirrored in these two graphs. You have a coherent expression of neoconservative categories. And by coherent, I mean that there's one dominant neoconservative category or a couple of dominant categories that are coming through. And in this case, we see here in red, extreme characterization of the adversary comes in at 50.5% of the time. That's clearly a dominant category. Interestingly, there seems to be a sort of cue-taking happening here on the part of the New York Times from the administration, as the two categories, or the one category that's emphasized most frequently, is the same across these two different media. Again, red representing extreme characterization of the adversary. We see the same thing happening, the same trend in the second time period of September 12, 2002. Again, you have 52% of the articles supporting the administration's point of view, very coherent neoconservative category expression, even more than in the first period, under attack and extreme characterization of the adversary. Under attack here at 48.3%, extreme characterization of the adversary at 26.2%. And again, we see cue-taking on the part of the New York Times from the Bush administration, as the two categories that are emphasized the most frequently are the same across the two media. Fortunately, there's something hopeful that happened in the last time period, thank God. We see here that only 27.8% of the articles support the administration's point of view, which demonstrates that probably the New York Times is becoming more objective, less biased, and therefore returning to the public service function that they purportedly have. Additionally, we see a concurrent decrease in coherence of neoconservative categories. Although this category is slightly more dominant than others, it's not incredibly more dominant, and also this category here, alternative frames, ups from about 4% as it was represented in the other slides to 11%, which is a significantly higher number. So we can see here that the New York Times is doing a little bit better. Still, even though we have a positive note, my findings still support my hypothesis, and essentially reveal that there is in fact a powerful minority within American society, within our government, the neoconservatives, that have been able to shape the discourse about terrorism and the war in Iraq for the American news media. This particular conclusion supports the causal model of public opinion formation that I have developed. I have said that the current literature that focuses on the relationship between the American news media and public opinion formation is inadequate, and that the relationship between the government and the news media and the way in which the government is able to frame, agenda set, and prime issues for the news media needs to be taken into account. My findings demonstrate that indeed this is an important relationship that holds water. Further, my work furthers, that's awkward, Tocqueville and Noel Neumann's work about how minority tyranny is possible. Tocqueville incorporates the importance of the relationship between the individual and majority, which we understand now to be minority opinion in societies. Noel Neumann incorporated the importance of the mass media, updating Tocqueville's work to the 20th century. And I'm now introducing the importance of the relationship between the government and the mass media, as well as the way in which the government can also play this role of minority group, as Tocqueville has explained. Now, finally, my work isn't just important or interesting because of the theoretical implications that it has, but because it suggests the need for public policy reform and consumer awareness, because this has real-world implications. Public policy needs to change about this. We need antitrust laws. We need something to fix what's going on in the state with the state of corporate conglomerated media. And also, we need to be aware as consumers. People like me and you need to watch what we're reading. We need we need to be critical readers. We need to assess what we're reading. We need to question what we're reading, because clearly it's not always telling us the truth. And as we can see, if we just think about the current events that are happening in society now, when you have something like Bush, plus Libby, plus Judy Miller, you just can't trust the news media. You have got to be careful, and you have got to be critical of what you read. Before I finish to wrap this up, I want to criticize my own work first before you get a chance to do it, and tell you a couple of points of further research that I think would be interesting. First and foremost, the question comes to mind, and the question that Greg put to me yesterday in sales was, what about intercoded reliability? I think it's a great question. My answer to that question is that I'm trying to get money from the dean of the college. Hopefully they'll give me money so that I can pay people. I had people code, but I need to actually pay people so that they have an incentive to spend an inordinate amount of time coding a sample set of my work so that I can establish intercoded reliability. And the importance of this is so that I can say I was, being objective in the way I coded my speeches and the way I coded my articles. Okay, I realize I need to do this. Please give me money, someone. Okay, next, public opinion statistics. I think it would be incredibly important to look at public opinion statistics from the time periods that I coded, because I'm basically assuming that the model put forth in the literature, that relationship between the news media and public opinion formation, is true. That relationship might not be true. I realize that I'm assuming this. So it's very important that I go back and look at public opinion statistics from those time periods so that I can actually really make all the statements that I'm making. I realize that this is an assumption. All right, third, I think it would be good to look at other print media and broadcast media. I had my own time constraints, my own institutional time constraints, much like these journalists, 10 weeks, and was only able to look at the New York Times. Coding 97 articles takes a hell of a lot of time. But anyway, it would really be good for my work if I coded other print media, brought in TV media. As a lot of us know, television media is a totally different animal than print. So I think that would be useful. Fourth, I should code more presidential speeches. As I'm sure you noticed, I didn't code any speeches by Bush during that last time period that I coded for the New York Times, that March 20th, 2003 period. Because when I started my work, I thought, I just need to code President Bush's speeches during that time period in which the Bush doctrine is developing. But by the time I got to the end of my work and the end of the term, I realized it would have made a lot of sense to also code Bush's speeches at that final March 20th time period. So I think that to really drive this paper home, I should go back and do more coding. And finally, this is more of a further research kind of topic, this idea of a crisis model. So what am I talking about? I've been thinking more about my work, and it seems like it would be really interesting to go back and code speeches and Bush speeches and New York Times articles right before September 11th, 2001, to see if what I've been noticing is just a continuous trend, if the New York Times has been biased the whole time, or if this was some sort of change, a sudden change that was brought on by the terrorist attacks. And I have this gut feeling that it was a change. And the reason why I have this gut feeling is because I'm a media consumer, I watch the news all the time, and I'm sure a lot of you do too, and you may agree with me on this point. So if that is in fact true, there might be an interesting paper to develop from that about the crisis model of the news media, as I've been calling it so far. And what would be interesting to do with that is to go back over time and look at different crises in American history and see if in fact the news media changes its stance before, during, and after different crisis situations develop. And I think this is particularly important to pursue because a crisis like September 11th, or going to war, is the most important time for the news media not to be biased, to be objective. But I actually think, I have this gut feeling, that that's the time when the news media becomes actually the most biased. So check with me in 5 years, maybe I'll have written a paper about this, but that's where I'm headed with this work. So that's it. I'm going to stop talking. Please ask me questions. And if you need to leave, feel free. I'm not going to be offended. I understand. Thank you for coming. Any questions?
I got one.
Okay, Taryn.
Well, I mean, if there were.
Go ahead.
This kind of shows my ignorance in terms of political science, I guess.
Philosophy people are just...
Yeah, something like that. I haven't taken intro yet, but your categories for coding. How many of those, I can understand them as a group being representative of the neoconservative position, but how many are individually also overlapped in other kind of positions?
Well,
so, my thought with this is that it seems like it might get messy if, community values might also be espoused by a different kind of political science take on the world.
Mm-hmm. I guess the assumption implicit in what I was doing here is that the Bush administration's predominant ideology is that of neoconservatism. So that because that's their predominant ideology, which I guess could be disputed, but because I assumed that was their predominant ideology, I pinned all of their rhetoric on that ideology. That was my thinking about that.
But what I'm saying is that a New York Times article could have phrases that you were coding as representative of neoconservatism, when actually an author might be, using that phrase in their own kind of, liberal political viewpoint.
I think that could be true, but the neoconservative categories that most frequently appeared are the language that the New York Times is using was very flagrant and specific, like under attack, the idea of being under attack, or this extreme characterization of the adversary. Those were two of the most salient categories that appeared in the New York Times. And perhaps if religion or community values was more often the ones that were mentioned, I could see that those categories more likely cross over in other areas. But I think that because of the fact that the categories that most frequently appeared in the New York Times were indeed some of the most extreme, some of the ones that are most clearly neoconservative in orientation, I think that accounts for that difference. Although I think that's a very good point. And additionally, I think the fact that I coded for tone of the neoconservative articles kind of accounts for that. Because if the New York Times is adopting the language of neoconservatism and supporting it, much like I showed when they say war on terrorism is a neoconservative idea. This is part of the administration's doctrine. So I think that's how I would account for that. Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions? Professor Kaiser.
How do you know that what you're hypothesizing as a minority perspective, this neoconservative perspective that then overtakes the New York Times and creates this bias, isn't really a majority perspective? And that all the New York Times is doing is not showing bias, but showing, being a mirror to the perspective of the nation as a whole. When you say things like extreme characterization of adversaries, a nation under attack, strong sense of religion and national exceptionalism, I would think that those are not the views of a minority cabal that's trying to tyrannize the majority. They're the views of a majority that has been growing, as is evident from election returns since the 60s, the conservative Republican perspective that has been successful in taking a lot of voters away from any other party that might exist, the Democrats and whatever else. And perhaps what we've got, I'm putting forward an alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is that the perspective, the general perspective that you're talking about of nationalism and global moral polarity already existed for quite a while. And then in the midst of a rally around the flag period, when we've been attacked, large numbers of the public joined willingly, rather than being deceived by some cabal of neoconservatives, joined willingly to believe that we needed to act unilaterally, that we needed to pursue a preemptive war, and that our adversaries were a bunch of terrorists who deserved to be punished.
Well, I think that the fact that these ideas are, you can locate them in the neoconservative thinking, that they are in fact neoconservative ideas, isn't insignificant. I think that's an important point to discuss. And I also think that the fact that I haven't looked at public opinion statistics, something that I noted that I need to do, would in part account for this, because I don't know what how the public responded to these before and after, how they felt about these different ideas. Additionally, it seems...
issues of... let's just use an analogy maybe for a second. We could find ideas of racial equality located in the civil rights movement leadership. We could look at the NAACP and CORE and Martin Luther King speeches, and then we'd see them have spread to the nation as a whole. Would we make the conclusion, would we draw the conclusion that there's something particularly deceptive, like we're doing with neoconservatives, that there's something particularly deceptive about about the behavior of Martin Luther King and the NAACP, and that they've disseminated their ideas to a much broader public?
Well, I think what's important here is that these ideas may be within the American public. I think there are like a lot of ideas. It's kind of like a soup. There are a lot of things that Americans are thinking about. But the fact that these ideas and this particular ideology can be pinned to neoconservatism demonstrates that they were able to prime these issues. And in the social psychology literature, priming is often talked about as being able to activate different categories that might be existing. You might have a lot of different things that people are thinking about. People think about equality. People also think about liberty. Which one do they value more? It's not really easy to say. But these particular ideas were primed. They were pulled out of different people and therefore activated. People were activated to act on these particular ideas that the neoconservatives emphasized. I think people could equally be activated to act on other ideas, as they were in the civil rights movement. So I think the fact that neoconservatives emphasize these particular ideas and put forward this very particular ideology accounts for why people responded the way they did and to the degree that they responded. I don't think that. I think you're right. I think those ideas are in people's minds. I think that's true. But like I said, I think there are a lot of other ideas that people have, and it depends on which ones are activated. Yes, Greg.
If I could follow up on that, the question I had is that public opinion is sort of like the dependent variable. It's at the right-hand side of all these models, and there's no sort of feedback effect for it. And it strikes me that the media has perhaps, and it's been accused of, sort of coming full circle on this now and being hypercritical of the war in Iraq to the point where it's not reporting positive news. I'm not sure if I believe all that, but that's the claim on one side of things, right? So it suggests then that the media isn't sort of the neutral arbiter of the government opinion, but that it's more or less sensitive to government inputs depending upon how popular it thinks those things might be in the public. And so now, where the Bush administration's popularity has fallen, right? Now it doesn't take the government view quite so uncritically. It doesn't act as the cipher that it was acting as. And now, bolstered by plummeting presidential popularity, it's found its new backbone. Vis-a-vis the administration. So then, do you need to generate a more complicated model where there's a public opinion feedback part?
I think that ties into what I was talking about with the need to examine a crisis model of the news media. I think it's really hard for me to further my work without looking at what happened before and without looking more at what happened after. Although I think it's possible that maybe it's a combination of government ideology plus public opinion emphasis equals news media emphasis. I think that's an equally as likely hypothesis. I honestly, I don't think this is conclusive, but so I hope that answers your question.
I think people may have to leave.
Oh.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. So, thank you very much.